For joining us this afternoon. It looks like we've got a few people who have joined us. That's fantastic. We are just going to wait a few more minutes because we did have a few more registrations. So what I might ask everyone to do is to just pop yourselves on mute if that's okay, just while we're going through the webinar, just so no one has any sort of funny background noise, if that's okay. But by all means, I mean, if you'd like to take yourselves off mute now and say hello, you absolutely can. But otherwise, jump into the chat. Please type to us in the chat, what school are you from? What year level do you teach? We always love to hear that as well. It's always interesting just to see who's joined us, what type of education you guys are involved in. So definitely, yeah, jump in and say hello. Yeah, as I said, we'll kick off in a few minutes. We'll just give everyone a little bit of time. I'm just going to use my power buttons to turn anyone on mute if I can. Well done to all of you for joining us at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. I know you're all probably exhausted after a day at school. And I said this last week, actually, in our webinar. Well done, particularly to anyone who's joining us from New Zealand, because it's actually 6:30 over there. So you guys have had an incredibly long day. So well done to anyone from NZ who's joined us. You guys are amazing. Okay, I can see we've got more and more people coming in through the call. That's fantastic. So yeah, we might just wait a couple more minutes. See who comes in. We do have my fabulous colleague Rachel, who is going to be manning the chat. I am definitely not coordinated enough to present and do the chat at the same time. So we decided that having a separate person doing the chat is way easier. So if at any point in time you guys want to pop anything in the chat, anything specific, just pop it in there, and then Rachel will sort of let me know at the end, and I can address any questions or any sort of admin tasks, something like that. But yeah, so if you've got any queries, just pop anything in there. But for now, yeah, please introduce yourself. Please say hi in the chat if you would like. Please let us know where you're from. But we'll just wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for some more people to come in, and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, I am going to get started. It is 4:32 and I was a school teacher for many years, so I know that time is precious, especially afternoons. We all have things to do, especially you guys who are still in the classroom. So let's get started so that we can learn, drink our tea, and then we can finish. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rosemary Arnott. I am one of the digital learning managers at NTA. I spend most of my time working with our digital reading platform, Whooshka. We work with leveled readers, we work with decodable readers, we do a lot of webinars. I'm basically constantly researching reading education, which is super interesting because I spent a lot of time teaching in the classroom as well in primary. So I find it very, very interesting to sort of draw on those two areas of experience to then come and deliver webinars to you teachers. So today we are focusing on comprehension. And the reason why we wanted to put this webinar together was because obviously at the moment you've all gone back to school. We've got a whole lot of curriculum changes in place when it comes to teaching reading. We're hearing the science of reading everywhere. We're talking a lot about decodables, and we wanted to focus more on that other end of the stick, which is looking at comprehension. And obviously we know that the two are very, very tightly interwoven, but we wanted to focus a little bit more particularly on the comprehension side of things. So today, what I'm going to be taking you through a few key points. We're going to be looking at the different components of comprehension. It is a very multifaceted thing, so I really wanted to break down the different areas of it. That's going to lead us into oral comprehension and then reading comprehension as well. We're going to then dive into how this might impact K-2 instruction, looking at particular activities, and then we'll look at 3 to 6 instruction as well, and then we'll jump to the end, having a look at, so what does this mean for texts in our classroom, which books should we be using, and all that kind of stuff. So I always, whenever I am presenting or whenever I'm talking about reading these days, I always look at the reading rope. I love Scarborough's reading rope. I think it's such a nice depiction of the very many strands involved in learning how to read. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just as a little bit of a summary, the reading rope shows those 2 major strands of language comprehension and word recognition, and how these 2 are both absolutely essential in order to learn how to read and become a skilled reader. Now, the word recognition component down the bottom, that's more particularly when we're looking at cracking that phonics code and learning to read the print which is on the page. And today we're going to be looking a little bit closer at that top section. So looking at the language comprehension component. So if we sort of zoom in on that just to start with, we can see that as a part of comprehension, there are many, many different elements. So looking at these sort of 5 different components that Scarborough mentions, we've got background knowledge, vocab, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. So these are all the different elements which are going to contribute to someone's comprehension, someone's language comprehension. And keeping in mind as well, we're talking about, so they mentioned language comprehension as opposed to reading comprehension. It's a little bit, tiny little bit different. So they're speaking very broadly about that. So just keep that in mind, because we'll check in on that in a minute. But when we're talking about comprehension, the first thing to consider is that there are different levels of comprehensions. There are different levels of understanding, and these different factors, how strong we are in these factors, is going to contribute to how deeply we understand something. So our different levels of comprehension, we've got our our most basic level, which is literal comprehension. So this is sort of quite surface level, understanding the facts, understanding the vocabulary, and that type of thing. When we go a step further, we're talking about inferential understanding. So this is when we're able to sort of read between the lines and maybe sort of draw conclusions about information which isn't necessarily directly said. And then that deeper level is evaluative comprehension. And this is when we're actually looking at maybe the author's purpose. Okay, so what type of text have they written? What language have they used? What style have they used? So really those different levels of comprehension, which is influenced by those different parts that we saw in Scarborough's reading rope. So going back to what I pointed out before, which was that idea of language comprehension on the reading rope, I always like to break things down into its parts. So when we look at the idea of language, we can break it down into speaking and listening, and reading and writing. And language comprehension, as you can see there, that is absolutely incorporated into both of these. The difference here is that speaking and listening, this is acquired naturally. Now, of course, I'll say this is all assuming that, that a child is raised in an environment with regular amounts of speech and with their native tongue, and they, sort of have regular socialization. Speaking occurs naturally, right? So speaking and listening will occur by the student simply just being immersed in that. So reading and writing, on the other hand, is not natural. So reading and writing has to be taught explicitly. And now what's interesting is that this language comprehension component, when we have our, our preppies or our kindy students, when they come to school, we're able to sort of leverage that language comprehension that they already have simply from immersion, hopefully into helping them develop their reading comprehension as well. So that's really important. And this is why, when we're talking about bilingualism, or when we're talking about students learning additional languages, this is why it sort of adds a whole extra layer on top. So when we're talking about K-2, well, look, I say K-2 or early years. Again, I'll just say, I know it completely depends on your school. It completely depends on the students, what you're up to, their ability levels and all that kind of stuff. But the New South Wales Department of Education, when we look at that language comprehension component, they do sort of note that the majority of comprehension instruction in the early years does actually focus on oral language development rather than reading the print on a page. Now, unsurprisingly, the reason behind this is obviously because if the students are still learning to decode and they can't actually read the print, of course they can't understand it if they can't read it. So this is sort of why, and it sounds incredibly simple, but I think it's really important to sort of make that differentiation so that we can understand what we're actually aiming to do here. So when we think about early years, we're more thinking about oral language comprehension whilst the students are learning to crack that code. It's obviously an enormous learning journey for them to learn how to decode all of those different sounds. So we don't want to sort of complicate things by trying to get them to learn about all these different comprehension strategies at the same time. That being said, going back to that Venn diagram that we saw before, we can absolutely still encourage the development of these different language comprehension strands through oral language comprehension activities as well. So when we're talking about these oral language comprehension activities in K-2 or just in the early years in general, there's loads of different things you guys can do. And I think this is it's just about getting creative and just about thinking, what can we actually do? So just a few ideas that I've sort of popped up on the screen. One of the things you can do is shared reading. So you can see there, you've got the interactive whiteboard up on the screen. Even though the text is there, the teacher would still be reading the book out loud to the students. So if those students in K-2 can't read that print yet, we can still be looking at the book, we can still be listening to the story, talking about what are we hearing, what words are we hearing, and just drawing on those key components that Scarborough notes. So can we connect to background knowledge? Can we look at vocabulary? Just doing all of that without actually having the students reading the print themselves. Another one, if you're wanting to allow your students to have some independence when they're reading, and you're wanting to read their own text, this is when, this day and age in tech, digital sources for narration come into play. So you can see there's a little girl there just having a look at a book, but she's got her little headphones on and she's got the narration going. So using tech like that will all of a sudden allow your students to still access books and then still be able to understand the text with listening to it, even if they can't quite decode the text yet. And the other thing, of course, is when we're talking about oral language comprehension, language can come from anywhere. It doesn't even have to be a book. You can be looking at songs, you can be looking at rhymes, you can be playing games. I think it's just all about exploring the language that is being used, all sorts of follow-up activities, and just any sort of exercise, which is basically just drawing attention to the languages being used and the different levels of understanding involved. So that brings us to 3 to 6 reading comprehension. Now, when the students, and again, I know it completely depends on school, students, everything, but now our students can decode. We're going to call them fluent readers because they are able to look at a book, they're able to look at a piece of text, and they are able to lift the words off the page and read them out loud. So the next thing that we have to make sure is we need to make sure that they are actually understanding what they are reading. I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. I definitely have, when you sit next to a student and they read this beautiful passage out to you and they're absolutely perfect decoders, and then you ask them what it was about and they have absolutely no idea. It is so important that our students can decode and also understand what it is they're reading. And the simple view of reading just puts that so simply, of course, and it's just, I love it. It's just such a nice little outline of the importance of those two components. So word recognition as well as language comprehension, that's when you have that reading comprehension. They have to understand what it is that they're reading. So it is equally as important as the skill of learning to decode. We have to make sure that they know how to comprehend the text. So when we start to think about how to actually do that, that's when we enter into the realm of our comprehension strategies. And these just continue right on through primary school, and they actually keep going. If you look at the syllabus, particularly the New South Wales syllabus in stage 4 and even stage 5, they're still focusing on this. So it really is, it's such a long journey, but obviously throughout the different year levels and the different stages, they're focusing on things in different complexities. The texts are going to start changing. They're looking at different depth and all that kind of stuff. But some of the more common reading comprehension strategies are popped up on the screen there. I'm sure some of you are teaching these now, starting to teach them, whichever. I personally think that what's really important with these is having a structured approach so that your students can actually explore all of these. I definitely recall having a set program when I used to teach. The entire school had an approach to teaching reading comprehension strategies in 3 to 6, and you had to cover all of them throughout the year just to make sure that students can have access to exploring all of them. Because I sort of think of it as it's like a toolbox. You want to give the students all the tools that they need and all the tools possible for them to be able to understand what it is that they're actually reading. So in terms of what this actually looks like in instruction, the first part, which is really important, is that we need to model these strategies. And I've popped there, I do, we do, you do. I know we're all familiar with this. But the reason I put that there is just to highlight the importance of explicitly teaching these comprehension strategies, explicitly teach how we use them, what it looks like, and so that you can check for understanding. Do the students know how to apply these strategies? Do they understand what it is? And so I think that that's more going to be done in that sort of controlled environment rather than just sending them off by themselves to independent reading straight away, because once they're doing that, even though that's the end goal, if we start with that, it's just a little bit more difficult to check for that understanding. So I think that modeled way of doing things is a really, really great sort of progress check, so that we can start off, we can see what they're doing, and then we can monitor and then let them go off independently when we can actually see that they've understood it. So that's the first component, which I think is really important. And the next component when it comes to reading comprehension in 3 to 6 is to build this culture of metacognition when they're reading. And when we say metacognition, what we mean is essentially thinking about thinking. So we want them to be aware of their thinking. And the reason why is because when we're applying comprehension strategies, we might, at the very beginning, we might be talking about it and writing about it, but eventually what we're doing is it's all just sort of happening automatically in our head. So in the very beginning, we need to draw attention to the fact that the students are monitoring that in their own mind. And obviously for a primary school student, it's a little bit tricky to grasp that concept, but it's incredibly useful. So really important for us to do that. And I'm just going to go into these two sort of elements a bit further now. So when we're looking at that modeled, that idea of really modeling these teaching strategies, there are loads of different ways that you can do it, but just some examples. So, and obviously, me working for a digital reading platform, I am very, very enthusiastic about using tech. But you can see up there, for example, you might have, you're using your interactive whiteboard and you might be annotating. So everyone's reading the same text, but you yourself as the teacher, you are modeling this comprehension strategy. So you're not just sitting there reading it, but you're modeling it. What are you doing? Talking out loud, talking them through what you're doing. So you're really breaking it apart. And then with the we do, I've popped there just the beauty of maybe some follow-up activities. So again, it's a little bit more controlled here. So what you're really doing is you are teaching them how to use this strategy. You're checking for comprehension. Do they understand how to use this strategy before sort of sending them off into their own independent reading sessions? And so when we're talking about developing metacognition for reading, so looking at that next little step there, in addition to the model reading, I think one of the things which is really helpful here is a pre-reading activity. So keeping in mind that what we want the students to do is we want them to open up their book and we want them to be aware of their thinking. And I do believe that a good way to do that is to prepare them for it. So rather than just getting them to open the book and then afterwards going, oh, what strategy did you use? And then they'll go, oh, I forgot. beforehand, before they're reading, let's talk about it. Okay, so and this, this could be done in many ways. You might want them to write about it, talk to a friend about it, whichever thing you want to do, just to encourage them to plan and to prepare themselves and to think about, what am I going to do when I open my book? And you want to be talking about things like, what's going to be your strategy this session? And you might want to get them to share some information about just sort of upcoming things that they might be reading about, just to get them thinking. It's almost like a warm-up. Now, particularly, I have popped up on the screen here my absolute favorite teaching strategy when it comes to just assisting with like developing this idea of metacognition during reading, and it's called sticky reading. So what this is doing is it's just encouraging the students to just be aware, just track their thinking. But the biggest thing that we want to remember is that we don't want to distract the students. We don't want to get them to read for a minute and then stop reading and then, talk for 5 minutes or write for 5 minutes. And this is in independent reading now. So we're talking about the students are doing their independent reading sessions. We want them to start thinking about their thoughts, basically. And sticky reading is, it's an introduction to tracking your thoughts. So what you need is each student just needs a Post-it note. They are going to choose 1 or 2 things that they're focusing on. So you can see over the side there, you're starting with very, very basic elements. So we're just drawing attention to very simple thoughts. Okay, that's funny. Okay, I'm confused. Oh, I love that bit. Like very, very simple thoughts. And you can see over the side there, I've just popped 1 or 2 onto my Post-it note. So this is what you might do in that pre-activity. Okay, so today in this activity, I'm just going to do a tally whenever I'm shocked, whenever I'm confused. And all they do is they just do a tally. So they're sitting there reading, they've got the Post-it, they've got their pencil ready to go in their hand, they keep reading and they literally just do a tally. That's it. So it's not distracting, it's not taking them away from their reading, but it's just encouraging them to just keep track of their thoughts and just become a little bit more aware of their thinking. And then once we built that culture of being aware of our thinking, that's when we can sort of start to weave in, okay, well, now we're not just paying attention to, when we find something funny, now maybe we're paying attention to, okay, I'm going to use that strategy of connecting ideas. I'm going to use that strategy of summarizing, or what's the author's purpose? And so now that you've sort of built that skill into them, now they can start to expand a little bit more and use some of those complex strategies. So this brings us to the question of, so what texts should we actually be using to teach comprehension? We've got a zillion different texts in our classroom now. We've got blended learning, we've got physical text, we've got online text, we've got a whole bunch of different stuff. What should we be doing? So we know a few things from the amazing research surrounding reading pedagogy these days. And I've just sort of pulled out some of the key things which I think are incredibly relevant. So the first thing that we know is we know that only the teacher, not a specific program or material, makes the difference in literacy instruction. So essentially, you guys are the most important part. A book is just a book until the teacher actually does something with it. You are the most important part in this situation. So that is very, very important to keep in mind. We know that leveled reading books, and this is specifically when they're compared to decodable books, they're a little bit more engaging for students and they encourage them to read for enjoyment. We know that. And we also know that variety is extremely important when it comes to building a positive attitude towards reading. And we also know that engagement is absolutely key. If we have students who hate reading, that is a very, very difficult speed hump to get over. So it's super, super important. So when we go back to this idea of, so what text should we be using to teach comprehension? I mean, personally, I think it's just about how you're teaching. I think you can use an absolute variety of text to teach comprehension, to teach reading comprehension. I think the opportunities are endless. As we've said before, it's all about your teaching style. It's all about what you want to do. It's all about your confidence in using that particular text to teach reading. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And then the next thing that leads us to is, of course, so what about our leveled readers? What does that mean? I found a nice little quote here, and I just thought it was nice. There are many little ways to enlarge your child's world. Love of books is best of all. And I liked that one because it specifically just talks about books in general. It doesn't distinguish between any type of book. That is personally what I believe. I completely agree with that. I think leveled readers are a type of book, and if your child is interested in them or your students are interested in them, great. What I've done there, those are all leveled books. All I've done is just sort them in a different way. So they're outside of their levels, and now they're all of a sudden just sorted into themes. So you can use your leveled readers however you want. It just depends what your students want. It depends what you want to teach them. In my personal opinion, I know that leveled readers tend to actually be sorted very well in terms of their comprehension strategies, which does sort of make things a little bit easier. And I think the fact that they are sort of organized by difficulty level does make your job a little bit easier. I mean, you know, we've all had that student who is given access to the library and comes back with an enormous, you know, The Hobbit or something, and there's just no way that we know they're absolutely not going to be able to read it because it's just too difficult for them. So in that case, I actually think that leveled books are very handy because the work's sort of done for you. So it is completely up to you guys. Let's remember that point that we had before. You teachers are the absolute key to this whole equation. Make sure you have the confidence, because you absolutely should. You all know what you're doing. And that brings me to the end of our presentation. I think that was 22 minutes. That is bang on time. Very good. Look, I would love to hear from anyone who has any questions at all. Take yourselves off mute and fire away, or if you prefer to pop it into the chat, go for it. I will stop talking though, and Rachel, maybe I'll leave it to you if there are any questions in the chat, if you see any come up.
None so far, Romy, but we'll give it a minute or so. Feel free to take your mics off mute and just sing out.
Yeah, go for it. Don't be shy, everyone. Sometimes when we have no questions, I tell myself it's because I've done a good job presenting and maybe I've explained everything really well. Just kidding though. No, honestly, if anyone has any questions, by all means, take yourself off mute, guys. But otherwise, if you don't have any questions, thank you by all means for joining us. Everyone who has attended and everyone who has registered as well, because I know that sometimes people just can't make these webinars, you will all receive a recording of this webinar, and you'll all receive a little bit more information as well. Within the next couple of days, we'll be setting up some follow-up emails. All of the images that you saw me use there of just the interactive whiteboards, the texts, the narration feature, all that kind of stuff, the comprehension filters, they're all from our digital reading platform, Whooshka. Whooshka is made up of leveled readers and decodable readers as well. If anyone would like to have a look at that and have some free access, by all means, just reach out and we can definitely arrange that as well.
Romy, sorry, excuse me, Romy, we have one question.
Yes.
What is your suggestion for EAL students, decodables or leveled readers?
Oh, very good question. To be honest with you, again, I think it completely just depends where the students are up to in their reading journey. I think as the progression sort of suggests, the students need to learn to decode the word first, to decode the words first before they can understand. If they can't read the print, they can't understand. So when it comes to EALD students, it really just depends on what they're up to. If they can't read print, they have to learn to decode first. If they're ready to go, then by all means, they can use some comprehension strategies for sure. In terms of which books specifically, if they're learning to decode, the decodable books are excellent for those. If they have cracked the phonics code and they're ready to go, I think what we tend to hear is that the decodable books, sort of like what we said before, we are finding that for engagement and for enjoyment, the leveled books do just tend to be a little bit more interesting for the students. You know, there's more themes, there's more genres. So if you have EALD students who can crack the code and they're ready to go, by all means, put them on leveled readers for sure. And as well, that's where that narration feature can come in handy as well. So it really just depends what the students are up to. Any more questions, guys, or any comments? We also love feedback here, so any ideas or anything are always welcome. But yeah, I'll sit on the chat or just on the call for a few more minutes. If anyone wants to fire away any questions, go for it. But otherwise, thanks very much for joining us.